So in the real world, when us as consumers or firms, if we try to look at what's going on, we know the price and the quantity of a good or a service. That's pretty easy to see in the real world. But typically, we don't know the curves that generate them. So it's very difficult or impossible to estimate the supply curves and the demand curves to actually know them. So the power of supply and demand model isn't being able to estimate the effect on the quantity of a 20-cent drop in the price of a good or service. What it helps us do is understand the directional changes. So if the supply curve shifts to the right, something's going to happen to price, something's going to happen to quantity. These models, I've said it before, very simple. We take away a lot of assumptions that don't hold in the real world, but they help us understand what's going to happen when there's a shift in supply or demand curve, when these things are changing in the economy. So I have a quick video to show you guys to start off the class. Never mind, we're not going to look at this yet because they talk about producer and consumer surplus. That's the next chapter. We'll just get into shifting curves now. All right. So we said last class that one of the things that shifts the supply curve to the right is the entrance of new firms. So let's say in the market for smartwatches, Apple enters and they begin selling smartwatches. So when they enter the market, more smartphones are going to be supplied at every given price point. So we're shifting the supply curve to the right, moving from S1 here to S2. So what's going to happen is the new equilibrium price is going to be where that new supply curve crosses the demand curve. So we'll have equilibrium quantity is going to be Q2, and equilibrium price will be P2. So when the supply curve shifts to the right, we end up with a lower price, and we end up with a greater quantity demanded for this new equilibrium. There's now more goods available. They're going to be available at a lower price for consumers. Double check there's nothing else I want to say to you guys about this. Yeah, this is obviously good for consumers because you're getting more goods at a lower price. This is very common, shifting supply curve to the right. With increases in productivity, increases in technology, improved technology being used, we're seeing a lot more goods at lower price.
Welcome again.
It is almost unfair that you're sitting in that corner.
I kind of, yeah.
I thought this class was at 12:10.
Honestly.
Is this your first time in class?
I was like, wow, it must be early or something.
So yeah, so if you shift the supply curve to the right, you increase the supply, we're going to end up with a lower price, a higher quantity demanded. So how much is the price going to fall? How much is the quantity going to rise? Again, without knowing the actual supply and demand curves, we're not going to be able to say that. We need more information for that. We need to accurately be able to estimate supply and demand curves. Like I said, it's very difficult to actually do in the real world. So for now, we can say the price is going to fall, quantity is going to increase, but we can't say by how much. So why does the price fall and why does the quantity demanded increase? So let's say price remains the same initially once the supply curve shifts to the right. At this initial price, we're now here on the supply curve. Price is the same, but the quantity demanded has increased substantially. At this price, consumers are only willing to buy this many, so the original Q1, but firms are willing to supply Q2. They're willing to supply more. So we end up with a surplus of goods. Firms have extra goods out there that people don't want to buy. So these increased units, what they do is end up forcing producers or sellers to lower the price of the goods. Because they've got these goods sitting on their shelves. In order to get people to buy them, they're going to have to lower the price. As they lower the price, they're going to move along the supply curve, so they're going to produce less. And consumers are going to move down the demand curve. They're going to be willing to buy more and more until they reach an equilibrium point. So at this new equilibrium, with the new shifted supply curve, we end up with that lower price, and then the quantity demanded decreases some from the quantity, supplied decreases from if we left the price the same. Producers didn't respond to the surplus of goods that were left over. Okay, so here's the opposite example when supply curve shifts to the left. You guys think of examples of when supply might shift to the left? It's a little less common, but it still occurs. There's things like natural disasters, say a hurricane or a tornado comes through and damages the plant. They can't produce as much. The cost of inputs increase, so if like gas prices skyrocket, it's more expensive to make a lot of goods. Maybe the industry is in decline. Supply curve has definitely shifted left for VHSs, right? Because no one's going to buy a VHS tape anymore. So, although a lot more rare than supply curve shifting to the right, it still happens. So in this case, it's the exact opposite. Supply curve shifts to the left. The initial equilibrium point was P1 and P1, where the first supply curve crosses the demand curve. Now as we shift the supply curve to the right, it's going to be, the new equilibrium will be where the supply curve crosses the demand curve. So we end up with quantity demanded P2 at the price P2. So the price is going to increase, and the quantity demanded is going to decrease. So obviously, a supply increase is much better for consumers than a supply decrease. The supply increases, you get more of the goods for a lower cost, whereas when there's a supply decrease, there's fewer goods at a higher cost. Do these two make sense? All right. So now suppose consumer incomes increase. Consumer incomes increase, that's going to shift the demand curve to the right. It's going to increase demand. At one point, I had tried to switch this whole example to the market for paper, but I'd have to go in and pull out all the supply and demand graphs and edit them in Paint, put that over. So ends up just, let's keep going with smartwatches. It's going to switch back pretty soon. So smartwatches are normal goods. So when the income rises, the demand's going to shift to the right. So we're going from D1 to D2. I know it's a little hard to see the little numbers in the back. So we're going from D1 here up to D2. So what that's going to do is going to push up the price. So where this new demand curve crosses the supply curve, it's at P2, so it's at a higher price, and then at a higher quantity demanded. If firms kept the price at P1, so they kept it out here, consumers would demand even more. Let me draw that on the board so it's easier to see. Initial demand curve, and there's our new demand curve. Initial equilibrium. So if we go here, if they kept their prices the same, people would demand this quantity Q3. But firms would only be willing to supply the equilibrium values, the Q star. So we end up having a shortage, where there are far more people that want the goods than goods available. So what they're going to do is they're going to end up bidding up the price. Firms are going to realize, hey, these goods are flying off the shelf. We can increase the price and not harm our sales. So the price will slowly move up. Firms will increase production as the price rises because now they can make more money back. And demand is going to decrease as the price rises. And they'll move up to the new equilibrium point right here. P2, and the quantity demanded Q2. Remember that invisible hand pushing the price up so that we can ration the goods. And finally, we have a decrease in demand. So say the demand curve shifts to the left. In this case, the equilibrium price is going to fall, and the equilibrium quantity is going to fall. In this case, fewer consumers want to buy the good. So if we kept it at that initial price up here, there'd end up being a surplus, right? Right or wrong? Yeah, it's a greater supply than demand, so there's going to be a surplus. Could be goods, extra goods sitting on the shelves. Firms are going to have to lower the price to induce people to buy it. That's going to put downward pressure on the quantity being supplied because firms can't make as much money back. And so it pushes down the price and the quantity demanded, or the equilibrium quantity. Okay, here's a handy little chart. It's much easier to just draw the supply and demand curves and shift them and to see what happens than it is to memorize all these. But they're listed here in the textbook and in the slides. So if you're studying, you will double check, make sure your answer's right, you can use them.
So what kind of questions would we see for this?
So I will give you an example of a market. I might have one. I'm gonna have one of my notes. Okay, so there's a hurricane in Florida that destroys the orange crop. Here is the equilibrium price and quantity before the hurricane. What's going to happen to the market once the hurricane hits?
The supply's gonna shift
Yes. That's going. Okay, I'll spell it out a little bit more clear than that. Hurricane comes through and destroys a bunch of the orange crops. So you don't have to assume that happens. You store a bunch of orange crop, you shift the supply to the left. So then what happens to the price and the quantity? The price is going to increase, so our new price, and the quantity demanded is going to decrease because of the higher price. When you're drawing these curves, and you draw a shift, you can either do like the textbook does. They'll have like S1 for the initial supply curve, then S2 for the second. Then like your price would be P1 and then P2. Or you can do what I did and use like the tick mark for the new curve, and then like a tick mark to just signify the new price. Either one is acceptable, either one's like perfectly fine. Whatever you do, just stick with it. Don't do something like this, like halfway through, that'd be confusing, but that's one, and that's two. Just be consistent, and just so that way it's more clear. So I'll say like something happens, something changes in the market, say what happens to either supply or demand, or both, and then say what the effect is on price and quantity. We'll be working with this a decent amount. We'll do some stuff with it later when we talk about like the national economy. So instead of like this being the market for oranges, it'll be like all goods and services in like the US economy. Okay, let's work through an example. For those of you who print out the slides ahead of time, I'm sorry. When I was running through class this morning, I noticed I forgot the textbook didn't have a bunch of these examples in their slides, but the examples are like coming from the textbook. So I think it's worth it to go over these just because this is very important and I want to make sure you guys get it. let's look at the market for beef. Let's say consumers, their taste for beef changes, so they prefer less beef now. Okay, is this going to affect the supply or the demand curve for beef? Demand, because it's consumers. Now, is it going to increase the demand or decrease the demand? That's right. People don't like beef as much, you're not eating as much beef. It's going to shift the demand curve to the left for beef. So now, new equilibrium price, what's this going to be? Compared to the previous equilibrium. It's going to be lower. So it's where these two curves cross now. That was the initial equilibrium where supply and demand. Now the supply and the new demand curve. And the quantity demanded decreases. Remember, if we stayed here at that original price, there's going to be less beef demanded than being supplied in the market. So we're going to have this surplus left over. And firms do not want that left over. They end up lowering the price. They decrease the amount of beef that they're supplying in the market because they're not getting as much money back for it. And consumers, as the price increases or price decreases, they're willing to buy some more than if they held them at that artificially high price, that previous equilibrium. Make sense? Besides being unrealistic that people do not like beef.
So they also decrease the quantity needed?
That's right.
Okay.
Because now, at this lower price, they're not getting as much money back for like each thing of beef they sell. So they're not going to be able to sell, or it's not worth it to sell more beef. Because again, the more you produce of something, and the more you sell, like the more costly it's going to be. Whether it's like people you have to hire, or if it's I don't know, a larger field for the cows to graze. So when we shift supply and demand curves, we end up moving both the price that we're selling at and the quantity that's being sold. Okay, so from 2006 to 2013, the price of Blu-ray players fell from $800 to about $95. While the number of Blu-rays traded increased dramatically. So what do you guys think best explains this change? Was there an increase in demand, a decrease in demand, an increase in supply, or a decrease in supply?
Increase in demand,
Decrease in demand?
and increase in supply. Can there be both at once?
There can be both at once. In this case, there's only one going on, though. Anyone have an answer?
Increase in supply.
You guys are both right. An increase in supply. What we saw is the cost of production falling dramatically. As a lot more firms begin selling, it's going to increase the supply to the right. The cost of production is likely falling because now the understanding, like the knowledge to produce it, like a lot more people have that. They can produce them at a much lower cost once you have a more experienced workforce. So over time, we tend to see the supply of goods shift to the right just as workers themselves become more efficient. So we have the supply curve shift far to the right. So the price went from $800 with 400,000 being sold to all the way down to 120 a piece with 11 million being sold. So over time, increase in supply can cause a drastic reduction in price and a substantial increase in the quantity being sold. And we see this a lot with technology. When new pieces of technology come out, they're very expensive. Very few people are able to make them. And over time, more and more companies begin making them. It's a lot easier to make them, so it becomes a lot cheaper. And the price falls dramatically. And then before you know it, everyone has one.
So how do you set phones, like for Apple, for example, they kind of come out with a new phone and it's super expensive, but no one's making the same Apple.
And why they drop the price later?
Yeah,
Don't they wait to drop the price until like the new model comes out though, really?
kind of. Like it depends on the phone.
Yeah, some of the things like smartphones. It's hard for one smartphone to do everything like another one does. Like Apple people will say like they would never buy like an Android because it doesn't fulfill the same exact needs as iPhone does. So they have a lot of market power where they can like dictate a much higher price because they're like, they're the only one. So that's part of the reason why you see such a high price initially. And then obviously once the new one comes out, people are going to want to buy the new model, like because people enjoy having the latest, newest phone. Okay, so a question for you guys. Which do you think is going to be worth more? A letter written by John Wilkes Booth or Abraham Lincoln? Abraham Lincoln, the great president, pretty much everyone looks up to, won the Civil War, all that stuff. Or John Wilkes Booth, a mildly popular actor who assassinated.
I think John Wilkes Booth maybe was more.
Why do you say that?
Abraham Lincoln was the president, so basically everything he said supported kind of. And everybody really said that nobody knows who John Wilkes Booth really was. So I think people would be more interested in like knowing more about him and his personal life, which was like not really himself.
Normally I'd ask for other people to answer, but you like hit all the points. So yeah, they did an auction a couple years ago where they had both one of Lincoln's letters and one of Booth's letters. And Booth's ended up selling for more. So Lincoln, being president, wrote a ton. A ton of people had letters from him. So the supply curve for Lincoln is like way out here. Booth wrote obviously some letters, but like not that many. Not that many people kept them because he was just like some stage actor they kind of did. His supply curve far to the left of Lincoln's. And even though Lincoln has a much higher demand for his letters, a lot of people would love to add an original Lincoln letter to their collection than people that want to add Booth to their collection. Because his supply is so much lower than Lincoln's, so much farther to the left, that it ends up, Booth's letters are worth a higher price than Lincoln's letters. They have a little blurb in the back of the book that contains all this information about Lincoln and Booth letters. But I thought it'd be cool at least to talk about in class, because it's at least a little counterintuitive at first, because you would think a lot more people would like Lincoln just off the bat, him being more popular. And again, there is a higher demand for him, but there's such a higher supply. You see the increases in supply swamping out that increases in demand. Okay, so now we'll watch a video. Oh yeah, this talks about Vernon Smith. I went to one of his talks, I think like my last year when I was an undergrad here. He exclusively wears Hawaiian shirts when he goes to like present at like real serious conferences where everyone like wears suits and like dresses up. He just doesn't give a shit and wears Hawaiian shirts. One time he dressed up and wore a bolo tie over like a regular shirt. That was considered like a big deal.
Now that we understand supply and demand and the equilibrium process, we can ask, does the model work? Some of the most impressive evidence was developed in 1956 by Vernon Smith, one of the founders of experimental economics. Smith actually expected that his lab experiments, which I'll describe in more detail shortly, he expected that they would disprove the model. But he was shocked when time and time again the model predicted exactly what happened. Vernon Smith was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002. Let's take a look at what he did. Smith's first experiments were very simple. He gave a group of students, called the buyers, cards similar to these, which told them the value that they placed on a good, the maximum they would be willing to pay for the good. He then did the same thing for sellers, giving them cards which told them their costs, the minimum price at which they would be willing to sell the good. Notice that the distribution of buyer values determines the demand curve. At a price of $3.50, for example, the quantity demanded would be 1. But as the price falls to, let's say, just below $3, the quantity demanded would increase to 2. Similarly, the distribution of cards for the supplier costs determines the supply curve. Moreover, because Smith knew the values that he distributed, he could calculate the demand in the supply curves and the predicted equilibrium prices and quantity. Smith let the students make trades in a double oral auction. Traders would call out, "I'll sell for $2, I'll buy for $1, and so forth. Anytime two traders agreed to a deal, the price would be called out. Sale at a price of $1.50. If a buyer and a seller, say this buyer and this seller, agreed to make a trade at, let's say, a price of $1, then the seller would earn the price minus their cost. In this case, the seller would earn a profit of 25 cents, the price minus their cost. Similarly, the buyer would earn their value, $2.25 in this case, minus the price, $1, for a profit of $1.25. Now here was another key to Smith's market. He actually paid the traders their profits in real money. So Smith's experimental market was a real market, with a real demand curve, a real supply curve, and traders who had an incentive to maximize the gains from trade. So what happened? Here are the results from one of Smith's remarkable experiments. The demand and supply curve calculated by Smith are shown here on the left. The model predicts an equilibrium price of $2 and an equilibrium quantity of 5 or 6 units. What actually happened is shown on the right. The actual market price quickly went to $2, or very close to it. The market quantity quickly went to 5 or 6 units. Moreover, exactly as predicted by the model, the buyers with the highest values bought, and the sellers with the lowest costs sold. In short, almost all the gains from trade were exploited, leading to near maximum efficiency, exactly as predicted by the model. Another way to test the model is to examine its predictions about what happens when the demand or supply curves shift. In fact, what makes the demand and supply curve model so powerful is that you can analyze any change in market conditions using a shift in either the demand or a shift in the supply curve. That will produce a prediction about what will happen. You should be very familiar with demand and supply curve shifts. Let's run through a few examples. The key here is to understand the logic, not to try to memorize the results of every possible shift. If you understand the logic, then with a few curves, you'll always be able to duplicate and to understand exactly what the model predicts. Here's the market for laptops, with the demand and the supply of laptops. We all know that technology has reduced the cost of computer chips, Moore's law and all that. The reduction in the price of computer chips reduces the cost of producing laptops. A reduction in costs is modeled by an increase in supply. The supply curve moves to the right and down. So what does the model predict? The model predicts, therefore, that the price of laptops will fall and the quantity bought and sold will increase. Pretty good prediction. Now let's look at the market for portable generators. Let's suppose that a hurricane is approaching. What will the approaching hurricane do to the demand for generators? Well, it will increase the demand, shifting the demand curve up and to the right. What does the model predict? The model predicts an increased price of generators and a greater quantity exchange. Also, pretty good prediction. Using a simple but powerful model of supply and demand, you can also understand important events in world history. Let's look at the price of oil over the last 50 or 60 years. Here's the price of oil since 1960. We can see a few key events. In 1973, for example, OPEC first flexed its power by reducing the supply of oil in an embargo. And what you can see is that the price of oil skyrocketed. The big price increase makes sense because there aren't many good substitutes for oil in the short run. We're going to be talking more about the elasticity of demand in future videos. The Iranian Revolution and the Iran-Iraq War were also important supply shocks, negative supply shocks, which pushed up the price of oil. A higher price, however, encouraged more exploration. And as additional sources of oil were discovered in the North Sea and in Mexico, the price of oil began to fall. Another key event occurred in the 2000s. As growth in China and India increased, that increased the demand for oil, pushing up the price. For the first time, millions of people were able to afford a car, and that increased the demand for oil. You can see that increased demand continued until this big drop in the price of oil in 2008, 2009. What's that? That, of course, is the demand shock from the big recession and the financial crisis, which hit the United States and Europe especially hard, reducing the demand for oil, at least until the recovery has started to occur. What you can see here is that the simple supply and demand model provides a very useful framework for understanding our world. Thanks.
So I did a version of that, the equilibrium experiment. But it wasn't really fun for me because I was a producer with the cost of production above equilibrium, so no one wanted to trade with me. So I just walked around yelling out a price that no one wanted to buy at. There's not quite enough people in here to actually do that ourselves. But it was really cool being a part of that and seeing how prices moved towards the equilibrium. If you've ever seen movies about Wall Street, old ones where they're all at the pit yelling at each other, calling out prices, that's what it was like, or like a flea market or something. Everyone just yelling what price they want to buy at, haggling with each other. All right, let's take a break there. You guys have any random questions or stuff to break up the time?
What chapters will the next test be on?
Next test will be on this chapter, so it's chapter 3, and then I think 4. Yeah, chapter 4, producer consumer surplus, and we'll do a little bit of elasticity in there too. But it'll be kind of a big overview. It's a bunch of math associated with calculating price elasticities, but we won't do that. It'll just be how responsive is this to price? What does that mean? That kind of stuff.
You like my socks. They are stellar.
They're very appropriate, right?
I know.
You're starting to celebrate Halloween celebration already?
Yes. Guess where they're from?
Where?
Rite Aid. And they were $1.
Wow.
So I bought all of them.
So this is not an advertisement because you bought them all.
Well, I bought all the cute ones. So if you want a not so cute ones, but I bought them for my sister, all my friends.
Pretty cool.
Thanks.
See at the mess, you can't see me make a sarcastic face like I just did there. Anything else, or we can jump back into it?
What would happen if, like, say, big producers like most goods like China would just randomly China completely stop giving, it got blown up or something, right? So they can't produce, no other countries buy it. What would happen?
Well, you'll see the supply for a lot of goods shift to the left. There'll be a decrease in supply because think of how much stuff comes out of China. It's such a large economy.
Yeah, that's what I kind of mean. What if a large market were to just get wiped off the face, right?
Yeah, there'd be a lot of carnage from that. I mean, obviously the physical carnage, but then economic carnage. You'd see a substantial increase in prices for everything, and a lot less to go around. Because you have first of all the natural resources coming out of there, then all the production going on there. So that would be, especially China's such a large economy, that'd be very extreme. It's us, China, I don't know, maybe all of Europe combined, that'd be catastrophic.
Did you watch any of the games yesterday?
I did. I watched Red Zone, so I could see everything.
My team got killed. Did you think you good? Who do you go?
Giants play tonight, so we'll find out what happens. I'm not holding my breath.
The Ravens destroyed. I'm a Browns fan. I think
Oh.
they were, destroyed.
That's rough.
There you go.
We had that fake hope last
Yeah.
year.
Yeah. I wasn't super optimistic this season, but I didn't think we were gonna get massacred.
Did anyone even play well for you guys? I didn't see any of the
couple
games.
passes, and then our kicker, he missed an extra point, and I think 2 field goals or 1 field goal.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so he's probably getting cut, but yeah, we did not do good at all. Baker struggled.
That sucks. I'm really rooting for him.
I'm just hoping we beat the Bengals. That's all.
They missed a game-tying field goal yesterday from 5 yards out.
Yeah.
Getting my laps in now because I'm going to get made fun of by all the Steelers fans tomorrow.
Hey, I think you guys are going to do better than people think. I don't.
Well, yeah,
think
compared to
they're
last
gonna
year,
do so.
pretty much only way you can go is up. I'm just sad Eli had to retire on the bench. For all the shitty teams they put around him, he kind of deserved to finish off last year. Plus, it's the first year a Manning hasn't been playing in the NFL since 2007. I'm sorry, 97. Okay, so getting back to supply and demand. Over the long term, both supply and demand curves are going to shift in a market. Equilibrium doesn't last very long before things start changing. So we frequently have to deal with shifts in supply curves and demand curves going on simultaneously. So for example, if we're looking at the market for smartwatches, because I'm guessing the guys that wrote the textbook had just bought a smartwatch that year and thought it was the coolest thing ever. Over time, more firms are entering the market to sell smartwatches, and incomes for people are increasing. So we'll expect the supply of smartwatches, they're going to shift to the right. So we have more sellers in the market. And the demand for smartwatches are also going to shift to the right. As we have people with higher incomes, they're now demanding more smartwatches. Yeah. So what does our model predict? If there's an increase in the supply curve, it shifts to the right. We predict the price is going to decrease and the quantity demanded is going to increase. Now, if there's a shift to the right in the demand curve, we expect the price to increase and the quantity demanded to increase. So we know that the quantity demanded is going to increase because for both of those curves, it's going to increase, or both of those shifts in the curves. But we have two opposite things going on for price. Supply saying price is going to fall, demand saying price is going to rise. So we're not exactly sure before we draw this what's going to happen. So in this case, for this example, where supply shifts a little bit but demand shifts by a lot. So we have a much larger increase in demand. We end up with the price increasing. So the change in demand swamps the change in supply in this case. It outweighs it because the shift in the demand curve is much larger than the shift in the supply curve. In this case, quantity increases and price increases. Here we have a graph showing the opposite. So in this case, we have supply increasing by a lot. Here to here. And we have demand increasing by a little bit. We still have the quantity increasing by a lot. From Q1 out here to Q2. But in this case, the price actually falls. Now the change in supply swamps the change in demand. So the change in supply's effect on price outweighs the demand curve shifting. So if we don't know the relative size of the changes of supply and demand when they both shift, the effect on the equilibrium price in this example is ambiguous. And it's even possible that the equilibrium price remains unchanged. If supply and demand both shift by the same amount, the price can remain the same, but the quantity increases. And it's very rare, but I mean, it is possible that it can happen. Do I want to do? Might as well. Okay, so let's look at another example. So let's say in this case, supply decreases. We have the initial equilibrium here. Price and the quantity. We've now shifted the supply curve up here. Let's say the demand curve increases for some reason. Let's say there was a hurricane. There's a lot of damage caused, so that's going to decrease the supply for let's say like plywood and like supplies to like, I don't know, like fix up your house. So supply is going to decrease because of like damage done to the stores, but demand is going to increase for those because people's houses are destroyed and need fixed. Freaking did that. All right, so we know what's going to happen to price. The new demand curve, new supply curve, where they cross right here. Price is going to increase because there's now more demanding. That's going to shift. When you shift the demand curve to the right, price is going to increase. And when you shift supply curve to the left, the price is going to increase. But now what happens to demand? Or to the quantity, sorry. The way I drew it, it stays the same. I wasn't trying to do that. So there's an ambiguous effect on the quantity demanded here. If the supply curve didn't shift as much, it would increase the quantity demanded. If the demand curve shifted less than the supply curve, then the quantity demanded would decrease. So when there's both supply and demand curve shifting, one of the effects is going to be obvious. The other effect you're not going to know until you draw it. And if there's a problem where like I ask you to like shift both of them, and I ask you like what's going to happen, when you draw it, say like, all right, use that example. When you draw it like this, and like pick whichever one you want to shift more, and then say like supply is going to shift more. So then I know it's easier to tell like what you're thinking.
So like if you were doing an example like this with the natural resources, like the demand of it's going to be shifting a lot more than the supply would, right?
I would imagine in this case that if you're destroying, I don't know, like all the Home Depots are getting wiped out, like all the plywood there's ruined, houses are going to be destroyed too. So yeah, demand curve, instead of being here, will probably be like probably like that. In that case, we would see an increase in the quantity demand.
So here is quantity demanded?
Or, sorry, quantity
Supply?
being
Or-
sold. It's both. Yeah, sorry, I keep slipping up and being lazy. The quantity being traded in the market at equilibrium. Okay, so what's happened in the world since 1700? We've seen a lot of shifting in supply and demand curves since then. We have seen an increase in the demand curve. People's incomes have obviously increased substantially, but we've seen a much larger increase in the supply curve. Living standards have increased over 3,000% since 1700. We've had an increase in innovation and entrepreneurship, which has increased the supply of goods. We've come up with new technology to create goods cheaper. We've come up with or used technology to create new goods themselves. So we have a much, much lower price of producing all goods relative to our incomes than like any time in the past. People before used to have to work days and days and days to buy the kind of stuff that we can buy for an hour's wage. Looking like it's the end of class. So do you guys have any questions? Actually, wait. Yeah, let's hit this one slide first. It's going to be weird to pick up there next time. So suppose that there's an increase in the supply. We know the equilibrium quantity is going to increase, the equilibrium price is going to decrease. It's tempting to say that a decrease in price is going to cause an increase in demand, but this is incorrect. So draw this out. Increase in supply, so moving over here. So it's tempting to say because the price falls from here to here, that that's going to cause an increase in demand. But the demand curve already describes how much goods consumers want at that given price. So when this price change occurs, we're going to move along the demand curve. So there's no change in the demand curve itself. There's no shift in the demand curve because of the new price. You're just moving along that same demand curve to the new price. Yeah, that's basically it. Just wanted to make sure you guys understood that. There's a little thing in the back of the textbook, like warning, like sometimes people mess this up. So I wanted to like explicitly say it so that that was in your mind.